science. How can that be? That phenomena is playing itself out in the context of glyphosate as we speak. That the World Health Organization, as many of you may know, a number of years ago regarded glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. Right? We already knew that it was an endocrine disruptor. Lo and behold, IARC and the World Health Organization deemed it a probable human carcinogen. So, of course, then Monsanto snaps into action and starts debating the science, right? And then all of a sudden it becomes politicized. And then now we have a broken government in which can't necessarily address this issue. So there have been, in fact, yes, mass torts that have been filed, state and federal court. Federal ones have been merged into a multi-district litigation that's now pending in San Francisco federal court. And right now there's a whole battle of the experts, and it's going through this whole Daubert exercise. There is, however, a state case in San Francisco Superior Court before Judge Carnell that come June 2018 will, in fact, go to trial. So, who knows, right? With these personal injury claims, battle of the experts. Compared to the economic injury that we are alleging, and using that, frankly, as a basis to get in front of the science, not wait for the science to be further debated, not wait for the government, but to, frankly, address the issue. So we've gone historically, usually downstream, quote unquote, to basically Monsanto's customers, whether it be the General Mills of the world, the PepsiCos of the world, so on and so forth, who are all using, frankly, glyphosate to dry out their oat and wheat crops so that they can bring it to market quicker. And purport to be all natural or 100% pure, etc., when in fact they have done nothing to ensure that there is no levels of glyphosate. Now, important thing to realize that the EPA, when it comes to levels of glyphosate, have increased, right, the permissible use in oats and wheat. And lo and behold, as glyphosate use increases, so does the tolerance levels increase. We take a different position. We hold these companies to a different standard. So while the government may say something's legal or illegal, we basically take a position that it's a question of whether it's lawful or unlawful. Is it lawful to say something's all natural when it contains even parts per billion of glyphosate in the product? And so I think a reasonable consumer who is in fact depending upon and relying upon the label, right? Label is the law, in that they see this and do not think for a second that what they're buying, right, is in fact got levels of glyphosate. And this is popping up in everything from our oatmeal to our granola bars. So what we've also seen, unfortunately, is that it's popping up in our honey and our tea and basically all four corners of our food systems. And so the science is also emerging. Oh, what's the big deal, when it comes to levels of parts per billion, parts per million? What harm will it do? Well, what we've also learned from Doug this evening is that even the lowest levels, it's really the lethal levels that can in fact be even more dangerous. Not to mention, of course, the bioaccumulative effect of how it builds up in our systems. And, of course, then our gut biome. So let's get into some of the direct action that we've taken against Monsanto. So we, in fact, have targeted all those food products based upon simple truth in advertising law, state consumer protection statutes, brought in federal court usually, as well as in some state courts. So now we have a direct action using truth in advertising. So lo and behold, Roundup, right, the product that's actually sold in hardware stores over the counter to consumers, claims to be basically, it says, in effect, kills enzymes found in plants, not in humans or pets. And so we have taken that statement alone and taken the position that that is a false and deceptive statement because of the fact that science has shown that those very enzymes, in fact, do exist in our gut biome. And there's emergent research as to that. And so, sure enough, and it seems like there is, studies, et cetera, within industry and outside of industry, that enzyme has been known to be existing within our gut biome. And so we're not getting into personal injury with this case. We're not debating as to whether or not it is a probable human carcinogen or endocrine disruptor. We have basically simplified the legal theory based upon whether or not that enzyme exists in our gut biome, which it does. And so we brought this particular consumer protection class action suit that's up here in DC federal court. And you've all, I think, received copies of the companion consumer protection class action suit that is pending in Wisconsin federal court. We recently got 2 favorable decisions with regards to our motion to dismiss. We prevailed in DC, and then 2 weeks later, we got a very nice decision from a judge in Wisconsin federal court that we are allowed to now proceed forward into discovery, into class certification, and to trial ultimately. And so this is a tool. I know there are endless discussions that we can have about the gloom and doom of pesticides, but I really do think in this point in time in history where we are politically, there is something that can be done. And that, whether it's consumer watchdog groups or just everyday average citizens stepping forward and addressing this issue as the government is effectively imploding before our eyes. Allow me just to kind of just put this a little bit further into context in my last 5 minutes here. In terms of how we have found, frankly, now pesticides among a host of other contaminants seeping into other food products, namely conventional meat. And so what is terribly disturbing is that because of how ubiquitous pesticides are used, it, lo and behold, is popping up. For instance, we have seen information of atrazine popping up in actual conventional meat products. And so this was, in fact, while we often, yes, put corporate America figuratively under a microscope, we often work with labs to literally put the food product under the microscope and walk into court effectively with Exhibit A, that it either contains glyphosate, other forms of pesticides, etc. This, however, was a case that was developed through basic FOIA requests, wherein through the National Residue Program had discovered a whole host of various contaminants. Now, once again, there's a major distinction between what is legal and what's unlawful. This was parts per million, parts per billion. And corporate America would say, well, what's the big deal, right? But as we all know, conventional meat is probably consumed 2-3 times a day, almost every day of the week, and the bioaccumulative effect, so on and so forth, the sublethal effect is really quite disturbing. And so what we have found is that with regards to, of course, these factory farm systems, which depends heavily upon the use of a multitude of contaminants, including, of course, antibiotics, it is indeed seeping into meat that folks are consuming on a daily basis. And we have yet, again, used basic truth in advertising, all natural, antibiotic-free, to turn it on its head and against corporate America to address this issue that's deeply concerning and is not, unfortunately, being addressed by our present administration and the government. And so this is, in fact, policy by way of litigation. That as we see this issue being played out on a national stage, whether it be immigration or what have you, there is a real opportunity to really address these issues around our food systems being adulterated in the courts, in state court, in federal court, to frankly make policy that is addressing the issue here and now. And this kind of market-based approach is what I'm talking about has been effective. And that without, of course, breaching any confidentiality, I can assure you that with regards to glyphosate, for instance, we have situations where company after company have been either disclosing on their website the use of glyphosate as a desiccant, or they have removed the false and deceptive labeling. They have gone organic with certain product lines, or they have worked, for instance, with, say, the Detox Project, which I urge everyone to check out, Henry Rollins' organization, in which he is endeavoring to work with farmers and industry to help kind of transition away from a supply chain that is just rife with glyphosate and other pesticides. So I urge folks to ask whatever questions they may have and to, of course, continue the conversation with me afterwards.
Thanks. So I just wanted to kind of have a little bit of a discussion before opening it up to audience Q&A. And I kept kind of going back and forth during hearing your presentations of feeling like there were very dire consequences of using some of these pesticides, and then hearing about the details of the registration process, hearing the list of laws that apply to pesticides and their uses, and it seems like a fairly robust regulatory process, and yet there are clearly immense harms across the board. So where are the gaps? What's going on here? A
Well,
pretty general
I'll
question.
offer a couple.
Maybe other countries have.
Yeah,
have
one
something to offer
is
us.
that science progresses, and so something like chlorpyrifos that was registered in 1965, we have a lot more science now than we did in 1965. Another is that uses change a lot. As Kim was saying, we're using vast amounts more glyphosate than we used to, because for a number of different reasons. And what did you say, 14,000 products just in New York? So as in every 1,300 new a year. And so you start getting these synergistic effects which have never been studied, but instead of having 2 or 3 chemicals out there, we're all just swimming in this sea of thousands of chemicals. This doesn't even mention, by the way, the 10,000 chemicals that are approved as food additives that we're eating separate, that are, we're getting from our food separate from pesticides. And that doesn't even include the air that we're breathing that is full of chemicals, et cetera. So we're exposed to just so many more chemicals than we used to, and all of that is changing. So I would argue that with all of that changing, a adequate regulatory oversight should have to stay up to date with the changing use, the changing synergistic uses from other chemicals that may have similar impacts or add to the impact, and the fact that we just have a lot more knowledge than we used to.
Mm-hmm. So Jeanine, you mentioned that it's every 2 years you have to register, renew it,
yeah.
And that there's a host of studies that are required, maybe not for every renewal, but at some point, and that it's the pesticide is being examined, at least in New York, based on use. So even though it may be changing all the time, it seems like it's a very frequent renewal. So.
Well, we don't do a re-registration, we do just a renewal. But that's more of an administrative label type of thing.
I see.
But when we, like I said, if there was concerns that came up, then we would possibly relook at something. But we're limited in what we can do based on our regulations and laws.
I see. So is it therefore difficult once a pesticide is registered to then actually, sorry. We're going to beam us all up to Mars now, where it's much less loaded.
Yeah, once a product is registered, it is difficult to take action against the active ingredient.
Can you see us and hear us?
Because you get more products and different use patterns. So it is difficult.
Gotcha.
Can I ask a follow-up question on
Yeah.
that? So one of the questions that came up in the Assembly debate this week, where the Assembly banned or voted to ban chlorpyrifos, is why isn't DEC doing this? So can you just perhaps talk about if DEC wanted to do this, believe the science justified the banning of chlorpyrifos, what would it have to do? What would be the manufacturer's ability to demand a hearing? How long would it take, et cetera?
Well, the registrants could demand a hearing for each product. So
A separate hearing?
Yes.
And does DEC have the ability to bring them all into one hearing, consolidate the hearings?
Not that I know of. We've never had hearings. We've been lucky. But another problem too is that it's New York, and then you have all the other states. So the other states can still use chlorpyrifos, so that means commodities treated with chlorpyrifos could still come into New York.
Right. But if DEC were to do it, they would have to propose a rule to do that. The manufacturers could have a hearing, maybe consolidated, maybe not. And how is the Office of Hearings? Would this be a hearing that would take a month, a week, 5 years?
10 years? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I don't know.
Okay.
It's uncharted territory, quite honestly. But it would be, I'm sure the registrants would split apart, and you would have to do each product separately by registrant.
So what's, other countries seem to take a pretty different approach. Certainly in the EU, a lot of the pesticides or classes of pesticides that have been mentioned tonight are banned varying degrees. So, I mean, if the science is fairly clear, do they just have a different regulatory structure? Is it, are their governments not as susceptible to lobbying? I mean, these are major multinational corporations, so you don't think that it would be limited to the United States? Is it different public opinion?
Does Doug want to take that, or?
I don't know.
I'm not really an expert on the EU regulatory, so I know a little bit about it. There have been some interesting, I mean, sometimes I think part of it is just the circumstances of the events and who's reviewing what. So they were considering a ban on glyphosate, and with the IARC probable carcinogen determination, there was some pressure to do that, and then recently decided to actually push that back several years. My understanding, a couple of years in terms of the review process. So, or on the other hand, with neonicotinoids, there has been a moratorium, whereas we're still fighting that kind of battle with the EPA here. And this, yes, the science is pretty much the same. I don't know all the details of regulatory differences, but there is, enough contention and uncertainty because of the complexity of the issues and trying to determine, for example, with the neonics and their impact on bees and other pollinators. You have to tease that out from all the other pesticides that could be affecting them, changes in the environment with weather and how that affects things, these, whether the exposure levels are high enough to cause what's seen in some of the lab tests and so forth. So, that just provides some room for, contention from the industry to defend its products, and for those of us who are concerned to push back in the other direction, and gives regulators, I think, some cover depending on their statutes and whatever political pressure they're feeling to, kind of work in that lacuna of uncertainty in terms of the decision making. I don't know if others understand the EU system better than I do in terms of differences, though. There is, I'll say one thing about some of the aspects of it, and again, I don't know the legal details by any means, but some people consider the EU system to be somewhat more precautionary. I don't know how that's codified, but instead of looking at the risks and having a burden to show harm, in some ways the EU system puts the burden on showing that a product is safe, and where there are reasonable scientific uncertainties, instead of going forward to have more caution about registering or using products than maybe the case in the U.S. But I don't really understand the legal basis for that. I don't know if any of the panelists do.
I think just to flesh that out, I mean, one often hears that the EU follows the precautionary principle or approach, which is basically who has the burden of proof. And in this country, EPA actually has to approve a pesticide if there's if there's no unreasonable adverse effects on the environment. So in other words, unless you can show it's going to be harmful, it is approved. Whereas on the other hand, what do you do when there's pretty good evidence that it's probably harmful, but it's not, you can't be certain? That's where the burden of proof comes into effect. Interestingly, in the FQPA, it seems that the burden is the other way, that EPA has to find a reasonable certainty of no harm, which seems to shift the burden, but it hasn't been read that way.
Oh.
Yeah. So
I would add one thing, though, that the difference between the reasonable certainty of no harm standard for dietary exposure versus the no unreasonable harm. I think what Peter was getting at, just to be clear, for environmental impacts, the standard is not as high for harm. It's no reasonable harm rather than a reasonable certainty of no harm,
right,
which is the dietary standard. So that does make it harder to prevent the registration in terms of environmental impacts, I think, than before dietary impacts.
Just with regards to the environmental impact, I think it was Rancher Carson who said, what we do to our environment, we do to ourselves. So it's so disturbing of the system that we have here compared to the precautionary principle that the EU largely follows. It's just disturbing that we have to wait so long to be treated like guinea pigs effectively, to then say to the government, to say to these corporations, enough is enough. You know, I had first got into this line of work with targeting trans fat over a decade ago, wherein, you know, it was still being, even though the science was clear, it was still being debated. We brought a suit against Wendy's, claimed to have 0 grams of trans fat. Turns out they had a lot of trans fat. Weren't sure the impact of the suit. Sure enough, New York City then outlawed it from every restaurant. California was to follow. But then it took a full decade for the FDA to deem it unsafe for human consumption, and it should not be any food product. So why did we have to all wait, you know, a full decade for our government to protect us when the science was clear that this is killing us? And so, you know, that's my perspective in terms of the EU versus the US.
Maybe just 5 more minutes before I can. The effects on pollinators seem very dire and have large ramifications globally in terms of massive die-offs in insects, generally impacts on birds. Is there a real concern about the sustainability of our food system? Do we have other ways of growing our food that is sustainable?
That was one of the issues I was trying to get at, maybe not very effectively, in my presentation. And you bring up a really important question. You know, we've gone down a certain path in developed countries, again, based on standards of efficiency and to some extent productivity and so forth, that's highly dependent on not only pesticides, but synthetic fertilizers, that the runoff of which causes massive dead zones. For example, in the Gulf of Mexico or the Chesapeake Bay, there's actually several hundreds of those around the world that impact fisheries. Over the last 30 years, I mean, most people are familiar with organic farming, and one of the graphs on organic is that it's much less productive, and therefore we have to plow under a lot of rainforests and so forth. More recent studies out of University of California, Berkeley, that have teased out that data more substantially and done what's called a meta-analysis of many studies, has shown that what we call yield gap can actually be much smaller than the 20 or 30% that's often been mentioned. It's really probably can be more like 8 or 9%. But if we don't completely ban pesticides, using ecological principles applied to farming, increasing diversity and complexity of our farming systems has been shown over and over again to be highly productive and much less dependent. So I'll give you, one example was work in Iowa State, at Iowa State University over a period of about 15 years now, where they've shown that they can reduce the use of herbicides by 90 to 95%, and other pesticides as well, while maintaining or increasing productivity. And they also have much better, healthier soil, much less dependence on fertilizers, nitrogen, because they're getting that natural ways. So they have much less water pollution from nitrogen. And of course, municipalities, Des Moines, for example, sued the farming industry because of the cost to its water treatment facilities. They lost in the lower courts, apparently, but it was a real issue for the costs of the municipalities to try to clean up the water that's being polluted by the way we do farming. But these studies and many others are showing more and more that it's not only doable, but it's much better for the environment on multiple scales, much better for human health, and much more sustainable, and with higher resilience to climate change, to things like drought and more extreme weather, because the soils can handle water much better. So the short answer is yes, but we're investing very little in that, and the pesticide companies fight it tooth and nail because, as I said earlier, one of the consequences of farming this way is that even if you don't go completely organic, you become much less dependent on pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. And that's the business model of these companies. So just like, it's kind of a corollary to climate change, where you have the fossil fuel industry fighting tooth and nail to maintain its, old industrial foothold on our energy system, and fighting, newer renewable types of energy. You really have a parallel situation with the pesticide companies and fertilizer companies in agriculture.
Can I just add one thing on that? I think the yield issue is also a bit of a red herring. We waste about 40% of the food that we produce, so we obviously are producing a lot, but even more, much of what we produce, even if it ends up in food, is wasted. It takes about 15 to 20 pounds of grain to get a pound of beef. We use an area the size of Texas to grow animal feed. So the huge production of animals in this country is, even if the meat is eventually eaten, is an incredibly inefficient use of food. It's like driving around in cars that get 2 miles a gallon. So if we didn't waste the food, either in the process or at the end, we would have lots of land to produce whatever more food we wanted that would be also a lot healthier.
Not to mention that we use 40% of our corn to produce ethanol, which really has very questionable benefits, and that's, again, a huge amount of land. Roughly 40% to feed livestock and 40% for ethanol, and then much of the rest is for things like high fructose corn syrup and so forth that have very questionable, nutrient value. So, as Peter said, there's a number of ways that we can do a lot better and become much less dependent on pesticides.
Well, lots of room for improvement and comprehensive forward-looking thinking that maybe we will get someday. So turn it over to audience questions. Mickey, you want to, I don't know.
Sure. Okay, I know some of my own questions, but I'm not going to have the luxury to ask all those questions. Sure.
I'm a little confused by a lot of things, and maybe you could explain something that will help me out. It's clear that you all think pesticides are pretty bad. I'm confused. Well, how do they actually get approved? And I understand because it sounds like the EPA is pretty thorough about their investigation. But maybe you can talk a little bit about DDT. And I don't know really the history of that, but DDT was used for a while, and then all of a sudden everybody realized it was bad, and it was banned, right? So if that happened, and that seemed pretty, I'm sure it wasn't an easy process, but it happened, why is it so complicated now that these changes, things that you're talking about, concerned about, don't go away? And forget the politics and the money part of it. I'm just wondering, because that's very easy. Oh, it's, obviously politics is a problem, so I understand that. But the science you have a lot of science now. Science has improved, and that happened years ago. And you're talking about these products now, and it's still on the shelf.
Well, I think.
Why did
go ahead,
DDT?
Jeanine.
I think with DDT, it was easier because the effects of it were so apparent. And I think that was, they could connect the dots. A lot of the other issues are more complicated. And it's easier for someone else to say, well, no, it's probably not from that. So they muddy the water with the different things it could be.
So the arguments
Yeah,
make
so I
it
think
unclear.
the argument for DDT was clearer. You know, you can really connect the dots, I think.
That's clearly a factor. If you look at chlorpyrifos, there isn't, to the extent it's used, it has high impact. And somebody gets sick right away or dies, as you say, it connects the dots. The battle really now is over these much lower exposures that have these longer term neurodevelopmental impacts that the industry, the product manufacturers are claiming, you know, the science isn't certain about. They're not really arguing about the acute exposures to the pesticides. They're arguing about the longer term, lower dose exposures. And that's where the issue of the burden of proof comes in. That's where what type of science is used, why Pruitt is trying to knock out this whole type of studies. So there is an issue there. But I would say you really can't say take out the money and the politics and the political power. I mean, that is an enormously influential part of why things do or don't happen. If it hadn't been for the election, chlorpyrifos almost certainly would be banned nationwide because EPA staff scientists had strongly recommended it, and if it had been a different administration, it's hard to imagine that the EPA administrator would have ignored his science staff or her science staff and not followed it. So that's a pure result of politics.
Doug, did you have something to add?
Did you want to add, Doug, did you have something to add to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you another example, following kind of on what Peter was saying with these neonicotinoids, which are the most widely used class of insecticides now in the world. The OPs are still very widely used and problematic, as well as some others, but the neonics are most widely used. I did an exhaustive study that we published about a year ago, looking at the value of those in seed treatments. And so what we have is, on corn, our most widely grown crop, prior to these neonics, about 30% of corn acres were treated with insecticides. Now, virtually all of the corn seed is coated with these neonic insecticides, which, again, were initially thought to be less harmful to the environment because those coatings are less voluminous than the soil treatments that preceded them. But it turns out that the neonics are so incredibly toxic at very low levels to insects and beneficial pollinators and so forth that they are extremely harmful. But what's driven this is the companies have a virtual monopoly on the corn germplasm, and they're coating and treating the corn seed prior to the farmers buying them. It's almost impossible. It's very difficult for the farmers to even get seed that is untreated. So that's, so again, this issue of profit, the nexus between the corporations and corporate control and how our farming is done is very important. They also have hired